In the early 1930s, there was one man who was the acknowledged leader among psychic researchers. He had been dragooned into the psychic work and had done his best to resist the summons. Before we go into the details of Dr. Hamilton's work in the psychic field, we need to spend a few minutes to take a look at the kind of person Dr. Hamilton was. And there is another fact that should be mentioned right at the outset. The Hamilton family were going into a brand new area of study for them, and they had no idea as to how their lives would be given to this work and how much they would end up doing in this field. The beginnings of the work were very tentative, and there was clearly no day-by-day record keeping. For this reason, there are events at the beginning of the work that have been given dates of occurrence that may differ by as much as 2 years. Clearly, the events of the very early experiments were reconstructed from memory years later without the benefit of written notes, and by different observers, and there is no way at present of deciding between the dates, since the participants in the events have all died long since. That the events happened at least very nearly as described is not in question. It is the precise dating of these events that is the problem. When the work became seen as of some importance, the dating also became more accurate and many more notes were taken verbatim. Even so, after the first years of the experiments, there remains a persistent tendency for the same record or for the same event to be given several different dates, although now the dates are rarely more than a few days apart. In these video presentations, I shall mention any event only once, if it is clearly a single event, even if repeated in the notes on several dates. Perhaps these discrepancies entered during the years after Dr. Hamilton's death, when Margaret arranged the notes by topic. There is no reference to these discrepancies in the notes, nor is there any acknowledgement that they even exist. It does not seem reasonable to believe that each of these events occurred several times in a sequence over a very short period of time. There is a major anomaly, and it is in the dating of the year that Dr. Hamilton spent at Harvard. One reference gives the year as 1917, another as 1919. Why this discrepancy was not noticed is a mystery. However, it should be easy enough to get an accurate date by simply contacting the institution. Having said that, we may move on to the record of the events. I have kept the original wording of the Hamiltons in these notes almost exclusively. For this reason, there are points where the present tense suddenly becomes the past and then back again. I have not attempted to unify the notes in this regard, except occasionally for greater clarity. I shall not make reference to such changes as they occur. For those who wish to review the events as actually recorded in the notes, I encourage a detailed reading of the chronological file. Thomas Glendenning Hamilton was born in Agincourt, Ontario, and his father moved the family to the Saskatoon area of Saskatchewan when there were only a few sod huts between Indian reservations, as they were then known. Thomas, along with his brothers, helped his father, and they did their best to eke out a living in farming. After his father died, his mother decided to move the family to Winnipeg to improve the opportunities for the education of her sons. The rest of the family went ahead, and it was a long move by horse and cart around 1891 for Thomas, now about 18 years old, and his brother William, who came after the rest of the family arrived in Winnipeg by train. Later, Hamilton spent a year or two as a teacher in the area just north of Winnipeg to earn some money. He then entered medical school, and in May of 1903 he graduated from the Manitoba Medical College and became house surgeon at the Winnipeg General Hospital, now known as the Health Sciences Centre. Also in June of 1904 he established his medical practice in the Winnipeg suburb of Elmwood, a rapidly growing area of the city across the river to the north and east. In 1905 he was elected an elder in the King Memorial Church in Elmwood, an office that he faithfully and continually held to the end of his life. During his time as an elder, he was also the building chairman and oversaw the building of the new church, which is still taking in worshippers on Coburg Avenue, just a bit northwest of the Hamilton home. In May of 1906, he was elected to the Winnipeg Public School Board as one of 2 representatives from Elmwood, and he served in that capacity for 9 years until 1915. That same year, 1906, he married Lillian Forrester, one of the nurses at the General Hospital, and they went on a honeymoon trip to Minneapolis, Chicago, Toronto, and Montreal, and that included looking in on the hospitals in all those cities. In 1909, a daughter, Margaret, was born, and one of the Lord Selkirk schools was built. By 1910, he was busily building the family home on McIntosh Avenue, near the intersection of what was then Kelvin Street and Redwood, and which is now the intersection of Hespeler and Henderson Highway. He and his family resided there until his own death, with a Hamilton continuing in residence until the early 1980s. Today, in March of 2009, the house is still there. In 1911, Glenn Jr. was born. Now, Dr. Hamilton spent 1 year as chairman of the Winnipeg School Board during 1911 and 1912. During this time, he persuaded the school board to acquire the properties on which the 2 Selkirk schools were built. The second Lord Selkirk School was built at this time. He also oversaw the building of the original Kelvin High School and St. John's High School. He was involved in getting the Playgrounds Act passed and free medical inspections for students, as well as fire drills in the schools. He served on medical committees looking into the incidence of goiter among the children in Manitoba, and he was concerned with the living conditions of Native Americans. He spent much time working to upgrade medical standards and hospital procedures while serving on the school board. His mother, for whom he had built a suite upstairs in the new home, died in 1912. He resigned from the Winnipeg School Board around 1915 when he decided to run for a seat in the Manitoba legislature. He won that election and served on Broadway until 1920, the area of his responsibilities as MLA reaching all the way to the main street of Kenora in what is now the province of Ontario. In 1915, twins James and Arthur were born. Dr. Hamilton continued his medical practice while serving in the legislature and found time to be instrumental in various reforms, such as getting the vote for women, Manitoba being the first province to do so in 1916. He worked on the Mothers' Allowances Act and the Workers' Compensation Act, and an act making the Manitoba Medical College a part of the University of Manitoba. From 1912 to 1918, he taught medical jurisprudence to medical students. In either 1917 or 1919, the notes give both years, he went to Harvard Medical School, taking postgraduate studies in surgery. He was already becoming known as one of the first plastic surgeons both in Canada and in the United States. At Harvard, he met Dr. L.R. Crandon, who was making a name for himself as a brilliant surgeon. They found that they shared a common interest in reading about the new psychic work of Crawford in Belfast, of Crooks and Lodge in England, and of Gillet in France, of Oste, of Schrenk-Notzing in Germany, and others. Some years later, they both worked in the field of psychic research. The First World War ended in 1918. It was also the beginning of the great flu epidemic that killed millions around the world. During the war years, the Canadian Medical Association was on the verge of collapse, and Dr. Hamilton helped in its revival and served as president of the association for a year. He also was a founding member and president of the University of Manitoba Alumni Association. Clearly, Dr. Hamilton did not go into psychic studies because he was bored and had nothing else to do. In 1918, at the age of 44, he began his first tentative experiments in this field, and he was very skeptical of the things that he observed. He was at the height of his medical career with a very busy life, a member of the Manitoba legislature, a doctor with a growing family and an expanding medical practice. He was also very active in his church in several capacities. It was in the autumn, September of 1918, that Dr. Hamilton's interest in psychic phenomena was stirred by a Sunday morning sermon in his home church that one of his dearest friends, Dr. W.T. Allison, gave that morning. With sunlight flooding the church through the stained glass windows, Dr. Allison spoke in a voice vibrant with conviction, reminding the flock of the depth of God's love, even though at times they suffered and knew pain and death and sorrow. Many that morning were greatly impressed with the passionate energy with which Dr. Allison described these potentialities. Dr. W.T. Allison was at that time professor of English literature in Wesley College, Winnipeg. Later he became professor in the same field at the University of Manitoba. He had gotten his doctorate at Yale, and he was also a graduate of Toronto University in Arts and Theology. He wrote newspaper essays that were published by Ryerson Press of Toronto. He was one of the most widely known and best-loved teachers and writers of his day. He had been ordained into the ministry, so he preached now and then, and he conducted the literary page of the Winnipeg Tribune for many years. For almost 2 decades, he also spoke on books over the radio and helped found the Canadian Authors Association and was its national president at one time. Later that Sunday, he lunched with the Hamiltons in their home, and he told of the experiences which lay behind his unusually moving sermon. Earlier that summer, while lecturing at a university in the United States, he had been able to participate in a seance at the home of John and Pearl Curran of St. Louis. Here he had met the discarnate personality Patience Worth. He had been astonished at the wit and keen mind of the communicator who purported to come through the Ouija board. He had been hard-pressed to keep up with the pace of the conversation to begin with, and he was amazed at the creative ability of the communicator. The skill at portraying character and plot rivaled Dickens, he thought. On top of that, she was a remarkable poet. Many of her poems expressed a love of God and humanity that exceeded anything he had found in classical literature. Mrs. Curran had only a high school education, and it was simply unlikely that the materials had come from her. But then, where had they come from? Was there a personality surviving death, as Patience insisted, and continuing life and creativity beyond physical death? He had come down on the side of the angels, he said, and now felt that the personality calling herself Patience Worth was indeed a consciousness surviving death, who had lived across the sea in 1694. She was able to give details of life in England that corresponded favorably with what was known about that time and place. So, in October and November of 1918, Dr. Hamilton and the pastor of King Memorial Church on Coburg Avenue, Reverend D.N. McLaughlin, began to carry out thought transference experiments. Dr. Hamilton would draw intricate figures or write words or phrases or express ideas on his prescription pad, and in a separate room Reverend McLaughlin would reproduce these in a remarkably accurate way. In experiments with a 10-year-old child, Lucy, daughter of another clergyman living in Winnipeg, her abilities came to light while she played with a Ouija board which had been given to her by a neighbor as a Christmas gift. In one experiment, Dr. Hamilton took a medical prescription pad and wrote one word, Lily, on the pad. This was an abbreviation of Lillian Hamilton's name. The word was covered over by several folds of a handkerchief, and Lucy read the word accurately in spite of that. Her response was, "Oh, the beautiful lily pad that floats on the water." But she was now speaking as Bluehide, an alleged deceased but living Native American who would be well acquainted with this flora of the northern lakes. This was the Hamiltons' first encounter with a will seemingly external to the medium. The medium in this case being a child who was not part of a spiritistic environment and who knew nothing of psychical phenomena. Slowly their researchers became convinced that telepathy is a fact. Now that their curiosity had been thoroughly aroused, the Hamiltons acquired and read the Patience-Worth literature and whatever else they could find on the topic of psychics. In the initial table-tipping experiments held in the autumn of 1918, another date for this experiment is given as 1920, F.W.H. Myers purported to communicate, and he referred the Hamiltons to Plato's allegory in the 10th book of the Republic, where he sets forth his ideas of man's future estate, the immortality of the soul, and the equity of the divine judge. Where had this information come from? There were only a few sitters and none of them knew anything about Plato, so the information could not have come from them telepathically. Other communicators made themselves known during this autumn. They appeared to be very certain of who they were, and they insisted that the purpose of their messages was purely altruistic. Their efforts were being directed toward communicating with the world they had left at death, and recording evidence for survival of consciousness, wholly in the interests of humanity, as the communicators expressed it. The world, they said, must know that the soul survives the death of the body. This was important for the further development of the souls presently incarnate. One night in 1918, during the telepathic experiments between Dr. Hamilton and Mr. McLaughlin as receiver, a prophecy broke out which ran to the effect that my son will be appointed head of the social services agencies of the church for the whole of Canada. Mr. McLaughlin's father was the purported communicator. When union took place in 1925 between the Methodist and Presbyterian churches and the United Church resulted, this forecast came to fulfillment. A second prophecy came during the same autumn of 1918. While Dr. Hamilton was drafting short sentences from Mr. McLaughlin's hand to reproduce, he suddenly heard words being spoken within his own mind, words which he felt strangely impelled to speak aloud. No notes were kept of the exact words, but they were to the effect that a great revelation of life after death would come to light through his work, that his name would be known for this work in many countries, and that his wife was blessed among women because the share of this work that would fall on her shoulders. Shock and disbelief, the reaction to this incident can be imagined. Here was Dr. Hamilton, calm, cautious, scientific, speaking in this fantastic manner. The Hamiltons had not the slightest thought or intention of becoming known as investigators. These experiments were with close friends only, and they were closely guarded secrets. It would simply not do for the Hamiltons' interest in such derided and suspicious activities to become known by the wider community. Publicity in this field was so abhorrent an idea to Dr. Hamilton that the only explanation he and Mr. McLaughlin could think of was that evil influences had somehow invaded their circle and descended on them, and that the whole inquiry must be abandoned at once. A very deep state of shock had come over Dr. Hamilton. He could not sleep, he feared for his sanity, and he only recovered after 3 days of bed rest and the application of strong sedatives. Now he thought that he understood that psychic research was not safe for him. He felt this endeavor to be dangerous to his physical and his mental health, and he appeared to be also concerned for the health of his soul. Thus ended the 1918 adventures into the psychic realm. To Dr. Hamilton, it was the absolute end. At that time, only a few were willing to admit to the possibility of intercommunication between the two states of existence. Very rarely was anyone willing to admit that such a state was a reality. Then also, in the final months of 1918, all 4 of the Hamilton children came down with a flu that was raging around the world. At the turning of the year, on January 27, 1919, Arthur Lamont Hamilton, one of the twins born in 1915, died of influenza pneumonia. Dr. Hamilton was almost inconsolable. He was a strict, stern Presbyterian, and he believed that his great love for his little son was being punished by having the little lad taken from him. Dr. Hamilton's decision to put a stop to all the psychic nonsense was firm and final. There would be no further investigations as far as he was concerned. But to his wife Lillian the road was still open. She had a deep and gripping interest in the phenomena, and she drew great comfort from the belief that her little son, Arthur, was now in a discarnate state but conscious and happy. Dr. Hamilton had bought a book by Myers entitled Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. Mrs. Hamilton read the book and saw in it the answer to the whole problem. Life did go on. There was intercommunication possible between the incarnate and the discarnate aspects of existence. The mental telepathy method of intercommunication, which had been proved to work between minds incarnate on Earth, must also be possible between the minds and the bodies on this Earth and the minds without physical bodies that existed in some unknown sphere. It also followed that minds of discarnates would communicate with each other in this manner in the planes of the hereafter. She did not stress her ideas to anyone, not even to her husband. But for her the problem was settled. Religious faith was no longer isolated, but walked hand in hand with science. It was a world of belief that helped her to part with little Arthur without tears and with an inner joy in the knowledge that one of her little beloveds was already over there, moving into otherworldly adventures. There has been much said of Dr. Hamilton and his dedication to his work of bringing and spreading the truth of life eternal, and the admiration for him is very well deserved. But far too little has been said in remembrance of the lady who enhanced his life. Without her, most likely the important work that Dr. Hamilton did would not have been done. This very intelligent lady was a tower of quiet strength, always in the background, mostly unaware and certainly unimpressed by the great importance of her own work. Many years later, one of the communicators from the other side of life, the far world, expressed his belief in her importance to the work by stating that it was around her that psychic work could unfold. She brought the energies that made the outstanding achievements of Dr. Hamilton's group possible. She was the dynamo. Early in February of 1919, Mr. McLaughlin went upstairs one night making his rounds, looking after his children which had come down with the flu, and to his amazement he saw, seated on a chair beside his desk, a perfectly calm and composed young woman. He recognized her immediately as his sister and exclaimed, "Margaret," at which time she rose, smiled at him, and vanished through the wall. All during 1919, Dr. Hamilton was busy with his medical practice and with the MLA work. He was running for re-election also, and his area of responsibility as MLA had been rezoned so that he now ran in Winnipeg proper. He was chairman of the Winnipeg Playgrounds Commission, chairman of the Mothers' Allowances Commission, member of various medical committees seeking to raise the standards of medical education, both in Winnipeg and throughout the province generally. He also gave considerable time to church activities and served on various boards and committees. In May of 1920, he was elected to be secretary of the Manitoba Medical Society. He lost the provincial election that year, and as the months passed and October 1920 approached, the impact of the seemingly fantastic prophecy began to fade, and Dr. Hamilton had again begun to do a little reading in the psychic field by men like Hislop, Lodge, Sir William Barrett, Crawford, and Flammarion. Now and again he even dipped into more spiritualistic books, such as W.T. Stead's Letters from Julia, Vale Owens's The Highlands of Heaven, Florence Marryat's There Is No Death, and of course he continued to read his all-time favorite, Patience Worth. He was not ready to investigate any of these phenomena for himself, however. He had recently founded the Manitoba Medical Bulletin, a small folder designed to keep all the doctors in the province informed on current medical, surgical, and pharmaceutical developments. He also had many social services left over from his days in the legislature. In October also he became a fellow of the American College of Surgeons. And now the door to psychic work was beginning to open again. Early on the evening of October 20, 1920, 3 people unexpectedly dropped into the Hamilton home for a chat. They were Dr. Ernest Court, a well-read Englishman, Assistant Secretary of the Manitoba Medical Society, and his school-aged daughter. There was also their little Scots friend, Mrs. Elizabeth Poole, who had long been regarded as a member of the Hamilton family, but who knew nothing of psychic research or spiritualism, and who had had very little education, in fact just enough to allow her to do a little ciphering, read books of the adolescent type, and write legible letters, although often the words were misspelled and punctuation marks were absent. During the evening, quite by chance, Dr. Court introduced the subject of psychical research, regarding which he knew the Hamiltons had some interest. He asked if they had ever tried table tipping, an old parlor game which he had seen done in the old country, and which he had himself experienced once, and which now and then, he said, brought to light various mind products not easily explained along any known normal orthodox lines, and in some cases even gave out communications evidential of certain dead people. Intrigued by Court's description of the results sometimes obtained by this simple experiment, they brought a small wooden table, about the size of an ordinary piano bench, into the room. To their utter astonishment, as they sat on the 4 sides of the small table, with their fingertips lightly touching its surface, the table became agitated as if in the hand of a giant. Soon it began to pound up and down in tilts on 2 legs in a most aggressive and decided manner. Dr. Court suggested that Dr. Hamilton repeat the alphabet. This he did over and over, with the table tilting to indicate certain letters. Lillian's mother, Mrs. John Forrester, took down the indicated letters. After a few minutes, the table stopped. Lights were turned up and the message studied. The table had tipped out a message purportedly from Myers, who claimed to be the chief spokesman. Plato, Book 10, Allegory very true. Read Lodge. Trust his religious sense. Myers. Myers and Stead here. Stead answers doctor's questions. We note that this is a report of the event already described for the autumn of 1918. It is not likely that there were 2 such remarkably similar events. Dr. and Mrs. Hamilton had no acquaintance with the works of Plato. They did not know at the time of the sitting that the Republic had 10 books, but they had read Myers' Human Personality and its Survival of Bodily Death. They were the only sitters who realized the import of the name, mentally asking, "Can this be the Myers?" The conversation following the sitting was recorded by Lillian Hamilton the same evening, not verbatim, but enough to give the meaning. Dr. Hamilton to Dr. Court, "Are there 10 books of Plato?" Dr. Court, "Yes." Dr. Hamilton, "What do you suppose is the meaning of this message?" Dr. Court had read Plato's Republic and said that in Book 10 was Plato's famous myth of the cave, by means of which the philosopher made known his belief that the physical world as we apprehend it is but a shadow, so to say, of a more enduring reality which constitutes the world to come. In Dr. Court's words, there is a very famous myth in Plato's works which symbolizes the unreality of this world as compared to the reality of the next. It tells the story of men chained in a cave, gazing at their shadows cast by the light of a fire on the wall. If Myers was living as he claimed, then possibly he also could so interpret the world of sense in which we live, as compared with the life which he lived in this more evolved state. Myers appeared to be saying that in his new state as a discarnate, he found these teachings to be very true. He further suggested that Oliver Lodge be read, and to trust his religious sense. He also added that he was being helped to communicate by the famous journalist W.T. Stead. What did it mean? The Hamiltons knew a little about Lodge and his belief in life after death and the possibility of communication between the 2 states under certain rather particular circumstances. They also knew about Myers and had dipped into his Human Personality and its Survival of Bodily Death, but of Plato they knew nothing. All of the sitters, with the exception of Mr. Court, knew absolutely nothing of the works of Plato. Mrs. Poole had no knowledge of Plato, Myers, or of the literature dealing with psychics. 2 weeks later, Lillian Hamilton found that a copy of Plato's Republic was among their own books. In the Republic, she found that in Book 10 was a much more appropriate myth under the supposed circumstances. It was a myth setting forth in allegorical form Plato's argument that life must follow death if we are to hold our belief in the justice of the divine judge, of God. To quote Socrates, "Well," I said, "I will tell you a tale of the son of Arminius. He was slain in battle, and 10 days afterward, as he was lying on the funeral pyre, he returned to life and told them what he had seen in the other world. He said that when his soul left his body, he went on a journey with a great company, and that he came to a mysterious place. He drew near, and they told him that he was to be the messenger who would carry the report of the other world to them. Then he beheld and saw souls, some ascending out of the earth, dusty and worn with travel, and some descending out of heaven clean and bright. And they went forth into the meadows where they encamped as at a festival, and those who knew one another embraced and conversed, the souls which came forth from earth inquiring about the things above, and the souls which came from heaven about the things beneath, those from below weeping and sorrowing at the remembrance of the things they had endured, while those from above were describing heavenly delights and visions of inconceivable beauty. Wherefore my counsel is that we hold fast ever to the heavenly way, and follow after justice and virtue always, considering that the soul is immortal, and able to endure every sort of good and every sort of evil. Thus shall we live dear to one another and the gods, and it shall be well with us both in this life and in the pilgrimage of 1,000 years which we have been describing." Dr. and Mrs. Hamilton were much impressed by the beauty and pertinence of the message. It is interesting to note that on the day of this first séance, a recently ordered book had arrived from London, England. It was still in its wrapper. When opened, it was found to be Lodge's book, The Substance of Faith. But where had this information come from? There were only a few sitters, and none of them knew anything about Plato, so the information could not have come from them telepathically. Encouraged by the evidentiality of the so-called Myers message, Dr. Hamilton and Lillian occasionally held table settings with the same little group, the theory being that as this group functioned once successfully as a sort of composite medium, then perhaps other important results might be obtained. They considered what was happening a group phenomenon, and they were not searching for one individual who might be a medium. Lillian wrote to Oliver Lodge about the message from Myers, and he responded with a letter which read in part, this was in March 18, 1921, "Thank you for letting me know about the curious message which you got by table tilting, and which certainly seems of an evidential character. It is curious that the name Myers, however, is spelt wrong, especially as it must have been spelt out by the table. This is not like a book test, but like a Bible or a Shakespeare reference, or something like that. And the kind of message given is rather characteristic of Myers as I knew him. I mean its brevity and pointedness. I think your communication quite important, and propose to send it to those who are especially studying this kind of communication, namely Mrs. Sidgwick and Mr. Gerald Balfour, or else I will send it to the research officer of the Society for Psychical Research. Yours sincerely, Oliver Lodge." About once a month, starting in February of 1921, Lillian Hamilton and Elizabeth Poole met and sat quietly in a darkened room on the second floor of the Hamilton home. In the second sitting again, words were given. John chapter 3, verse 14. Plato, book 10. The John reference is to the verse, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up." How the Hamiltons interpreted this verse is not disclosed in their notes. In the third recorded sitting, held in March 1921, the sitters had their hands on the table and the table tilted, but the power was weak. The letters indicated spelled the following words: Poole, Mother, John, Maggie, Mary, Tom, all here. Mrs. Poole informed those present that these were the names of members of her family who were deceased. She was very much surprised. The fourth sitting was held in April 1921. The sitters were Mrs. Poole and Lillian Hamilton. The table spelled all here, Mother, Lisbeth. Mrs. Poole told Lillian that her mother always called her Lisbeth, her name being Elizabeth. This fact had not been known previously to Lillian. At this time, in spite of the demands of a large private practice and much committee work, Dr. Hamilton's interest in psychic phenomena was again growing. Fully aware of the general public's attitude of scorn and derision directed toward anyone showing interest in such matters, and rightly fearing lest his professional reputation be tarnished if his own interest were to become known, Dr. Hamilton kept his interest a closely guarded confidence between very close friends. During 1921, he was honored by being elected the first president of the newly formed Alumni Association of the University of Manitoba. That same year, he was made a Fellow of the American College of Surgeons. The fifth sitting was held on May 8, 1921. The table began to show movements beyond merely tipping. The movements were very strong, even though only Lillian Hamilton and Elizabeth Poole were present. The sixth recorded sitting was held on May 15, 1921. The table movements were stronger again. This time Mrs. J.M. Forrester, Lillian's mother, and her sister, Miss Jessie Forrester, were present as witnesses. Lillian Hamilton and Elizabeth Poole were the sitters. The table tilted the following message: paraphrase, Mother sings old paraphrase, Lisbeth. 3 days previously, Mrs. Poole had called to see Mrs. Hamilton, and during their conversation told her that she had had the night previously a very vivid dream in which she seemed to be singing old psalms, and that she could not recall the words. The table movements were so strong that the two ladies looking on, Mrs. Forrester and Jessie, had to use a great deal of force to press the table back to the floor as it tilted on two legs. On May 22nd, they met again with Mrs. Forrester and Jessie as witnesses. The table tilts were very powerful, and a further message was transmitted by the tilt method. Poole, Mother sings old paraphrases, Lisbeth. The table remained in the tilted position, and Mrs. Forrester and Jessie had to push it back down, and it took the combined strength of the two ladies. From the notes, it is not clear whether this event really was a repeat of the earlier event of May 15, or simply referenced by a different date. The table tilts were also occasionally becoming non-contact by this time. The sitters would put their fingertips on the table at the beginning of the sitting, and then take their hands off the table, and it would tilt while the group held hands to increase the power. July 9, 1921, under Elizabeth's contact, the table, which rested on two legs, refused to be pushed back to the floor. What was holding it in place? Having recently read Dr. Crawford's account of the telekinetic phenomena which he had obtained with Miss Gallagher in Belfast, Dr. Hamilton, when told of this strange table behavior, concluded provisionally that in Elizabeth, possibly, they had discovered a medium who potentially was of the same type. Both Hamiltons thought the experiments should continue. As Mrs. Poole was a most obliging soul, she readily agreed to continue sitting occasionally with Lillian Hamilton. Lillian suspected that Mrs. Poole might be the source of the energy, but not the source of the intellect that lay behind these phenomena. This would mean that some outside intelligence was taking over Elizabeth Poole's physical functions. The energy manifested by the table tipping grew in intensity and focus, and soon was to display a number of variants. These quickly were recognized for what they were, various kinds of telekinesis. The spiritistic aspect of the sittings, it should be emphasized that the Hamiltons were never members of any spiritualist group, repeatedly challenged their attention, but mere assertions that the dead were present and aiding in the experiments had to be ignored, for simple assertions can carry no weight in any scientific work of this nature. Still, now and again, there were so-called telepathic events that seemed to indicate actual memories of the dead. One example will serve to illustrate. A Mrs. R., a friend and visitor from Saskatchewan, was running a Ouija board in the Hamilton living room. She stated that a Jack B. was present and wished to speak to Margaret M., who was standing a few feet away from Mrs. R., observing the queer gyrations of the pointer with some amusement and not a little skepticism. She manifested impatience with the supposed Jack B.'s claim and demanded proof as to his identity. Following her demand, a dialogue took place between M and the board. Dr. Hamilton was the recorder throughout. Margaret M. Well, if that is really Jack, he had died in 1970 from wounds received in the war, let him tell me where he took me to church parade shortly before he left for overseas. Board, Grace Church. Margaret M. Correct. Where did we sit? Board, in the gallery. Margaret M. Right. What was the color of the dress I wore on this occasion? Board, blue. Margaret M. That is also correct. Now can you tell me the name of the church to which you took Clara and me about the same time? Board, St. Matthew's. Margaret M. Not right, Jack. Try again. Board, St. Andrew's Church. Margaret M. Right again, Jack. I'm beginning to believe that it is really you communicating. Board, it's true, Margaret. I am alive and I'm talking to you. Mrs. R. knew nothing whatever of the facts and events regarding which the board showed clear-cut, detailed knowledge. Dr. Hamilton was elected president of the Manitoba Medical Society in May of 1921. It was in May of 1921, as already indicated, that the Hamiltons became convinced that Mrs. Elizabeth Poole was the one who possessed the marked incipient power for the production of psychical phenomena. She was at that time 49 years of age and previously unaware that she possessed mediumistic faculties of any kind. July 24, 1921, Mrs. Poole and Lillian Hamilton were sitting. In a few moments the power was exceedingly strong. The table tilted on two legs and Lillian tried to depress it back to the floor, but found the table seemed to be resting on a sort of air cushion or something that would give, but not all the way. Lillian was so much intrigued with this strange phenomenon, as she believed it to be, that she called to her sister and mother to come into the room. Her sister, Miss Jessie Forrester, came and stood over the table, and pressing downward with both hands, and after putting forth considerable pressure, finally placed the table again at rest on the floor. Dr. Hamilton was told of this incident, but said that probably the force was due to unconscious muscular activity. On July 31, 1921, the sitters were Elizabeth Poole, Lillian, and Jessie. They had their hands on the table. The power was very strong in a few moments. This time Dr. Hamilton came into the room and was convinced of the reality of psychic force. He said that he would judge that he exerted 50 to 60 pounds pressure on the top of the table before he succeeded in pushing it down. That is, bringing the two legs, which were tilted off the floor, back to rest on the floor. The recorder, Lillian, was very much amused to hear him grunting, breathing heavily in the dark as he struggled with the table to push it down. Almost 1 year after the strange and compelling Plato message, Dr. Hamilton had to admit that he considered psychic force was a reality to be reckoned with. He now prepared to do something about studying it. He said to Lillian words to the effect that this force, whatever it is a new phenomenon to physics, and it should be investigated scientifically, to bring it into the scientific realm. Understanding this force might benefit mankind. What was this force? Where did it originate? These were questions needing an answer. In August of 1921, they commenced their first series of scientific experiments. The beginning of the fulfillment of the prophecy was at hand, and little by little the door was to swing wider open, until they saw, as it were, within, clear-cut shadows representing the greater realities. By undertaking regular observations to learn more about the mysterious energy of telekinesis, Dr. Hamilton took his first real steps towards becoming a psychic researcher. He soon discovered that the force, whatever it was, issued from Mrs. Poole's abdomen in the form of invisible arms, which gripped the table from beneath and held it steady for an appreciable length of time against pressure. Crawford had named these invisible streams of energy pseudopods. Mrs. Poole often felt pain in the abdominal area when the forces were struggling with each other. Often this pain became so great that the experiment had to be terminated. This phenomenon was tested many times by various observers. Each reported the same thing. Judging by the sense of touch, the table's return seemed to be impeded by an area, an invisible something which felt like a cushion made of rubber. So far they had discovered that she possessed marked faculties for the production of physical phenomena. A few months' further experimentation revealed the fact that she also possessed mental mediumistic faculties, and from that time on these two phases developed side by side, eventually giving brilliant manifestations in both fields. Elizabeth Poole attended the seances held for her development more to please her friends rather than because of any particular desire to do so on her part. For all these experiments, Elizabeth neither asked nor received any payment whatever. Her time and talents were given simply as a good friend, willing to cooperate in any manner desired. Elizabeth was entirely without education in the academic sense. This, added to the fact that there had been no attempt at self-education, gave rise to a mentality singularly limited and childlike. To preserve this state of innocence, a general policy was gradually determined that she refrain from reading psychic literature, from attending meetings of a psychic nature, whether public or private, and that she refrained from discussing these things with outsiders. In the physical phenomena, they obtained conversational wrappings providing information, very powerful contact phenomena providing telekinetic movements of various kinds, and wax impressions of small materialized forms. The wax impressions were secured by placing two containers in the seance room, one inside the other. The outer containing water, which was kept at a temperature capable of melting paraffin, while the inner contained melted paraffin wax. Then, during a seance, a purported discarnate would come by and dip a finger or toe materialized out of ectoplasm into the wax and then into some cold water in a container nearby. When the wax hardened, the ectoplasmic finger or toe was withdrawn, and the wax sleeve was found to contain the marks of a fingerprint on the inside. The mental give many arresting phenomena also: veridical clairvoyance, prevision, and transautomatisms, both motor and sensory. For other bodily movements, the motor automatisms were sometimes accompanied by purely sensory automatisms, such as hearing voices or seeing visions. And the non-contact wrapping soon began to give intelligent messages in which Myers, Stead, and other deceased and discarnate personalities claimed to be communicating. On August 7, 1921, came the first non-contact table movements, with sitters Elizabeth Poole, Lillian Hamilton, Jessie, and Dr. Court. With their hands on the table, the force became very powerful, and Lillian felt depleted of strength. She felt as if she were going to faint, so the circle took their hands off the table and joined them to form a chain. To the surprise of the sitters, non-contact phenomena commenced, the table lifting, twisting, and creaking with the stress applied. A code was arranged: 1 knock of the table leg for no, 2 knocks doubtful, 3 knocks for yes. Under these arrangements, the following dialogue took place. Are the sitters arranged properly? Yes. Have we any guides? Yes. How many? Knock for the number. 7 knocks were given. Someone in the group spontaneously remarked that laughter was a good thing in a sitting. The table, without being questioned, gave 3 knocks. It was soon found that the intelligence had to be cooperated with if worthwhile events were to come to light for examination and testing. Dr. Hamilton finally began to speak to these intelligences as if they were living, unseen personalities, and results began to pile up. He invited Mr. H.A. Reed to join him. As time went on, he invited others, and some notable individuals joined him in his researches. Mr. Reed had become interested in Dr. Hamilton's investigations as early as 1921, and he proved a fine and close observer, and greatly aided Dr. Hamilton in his work in many ways, not the least being the devising of the electrical equipment necessary for the rapid photography required in the seance room. Mr. Reed was an engineer by profession. They now hung the table from a weigh scale attached to the ceiling and found, for instance, that the weight of the table always increased around 4 pounds just before a rap was struck on the table or on the floor about 2 feet beyond the table. And this increase took place both when Mrs. Poole's hands were held a few inches above the table or were touching the table lightly under another sitter's manual control. In all sittings, Mrs. Poole's hands were held continuously by Dr. Hamilton and Lillian, or now and again by close friends invited to take part as additional observers and verifiers. Her feet were also controlled by the adjacent sitters, and she submitted to every test and control willingly, while disliking very much to be called a medium. Mr. Reed, who usually took the scale readings, found also that the weight of the table increased when he himself stood near it, but not touching it. He seemed to be, like Mrs. Poole, a reservoir for the mysterious energy. Others were asked to stand by the table, but no such increase was apparent. From this they assumed that Mr. Reed, like Mrs. Poole, was potentially a medium, that is, one from whose organism flowed the psychophysical energy substance causing the phenomena, the flow being spontaneous. It is clear, too, that the purported discarnates could hear requests for various phenomena. When asked to increase the weight of the table, this was done instantly, the weight often increasing by 10, 20, and even up to 30 pounds. That is, so long as Mrs. Poole was near the table and held her hands either on the table or a few inches above the surface of the table. Sometimes the table seemed bound to the floor with bands of what can only be called a rubbery iron, bound so strongly that a man standing over the table and lifting upward could raise it only about 2 inches for several minutes. Again, there were times when they all heard strange rustling noises, or noises like the crinkling of paper or the discharge from some electric friction generator, and always in the region of Mrs. Poole's feet, and always just before an exhibition of this binding or weighting already mentioned. The movements of the table under these conditions were of 5 kinds: toward the medium, away from the medium, tiltings and rotations in a horizontal plane, and a to and fro or swinging movement when the table was hanging from the scales. As these phenomena were repeated from time to time, it also became apparent that, generally speaking, they were of a definitely purposive nature. That is, not only did the table appear to have a motive power of its own, but also to have an intelligence of its own. This fact was strikingly brought home at the sittings of August 7 and August 14. On these days, not only did the table, without contact, tilt and turn completely about, but as well showed intelligence by answering questions through the use of the usual code in these cases: 1 rap for no and 3 for yes. In August of 1921, non-contact raps again spelled out a communication which intimated that they were helping in the interests of humanity. This message was signed Myers. On August 20, 1921 came the message: Myers helping efforts in interest of humanity. Wonderful land here, never fear. Circle in circle, radiant, The message broke off at this point. When asked to give the communicator's initials, the raps gave F, W, and B. But the sounds were fainter, and the power obviously diminishing, which might account for the B rather than an M. The August 21st, 1921 rap spelled E-S-T-L-I-G-H-T, Myers. This at first appeared meaningless. Later it was seen to complete the earlier message, making the final phrase now read, "Circle and circle of radiantest light, Myers." This was a message purporting to be from the erudite Myers, now seen to proclaim the wonders and radiance of that other land, which, he implied, lay beyond death. On August 28, 1921, the message was, "Emotion too strong, tests hard to manifest," indicating that in some way emotions were interfering with the transmissions. On August 30, 1921, Mrs. Poole and Lillian Hamilton were sitters. There was no light. The table tilted first off 3 legs and then with special apparent effort off all 4. Dr. Hamilton estimated that the table was several inches above the floor. This kinesthetic aspect of these investigations continued from August of 1921 to April of 1922. Like everything Dr. Hamilton did, this work was done thoroughly from the start. Realizing the need for experimental quarters, Dr. Hamilton took over the bedroom on the 2nd story at the back of his home, so situated that it was somewhat cut off from the rest of the house and accessible only by one door, this door being locked during the time of sitting. Its 2 windows were boarded over and were about 15 feet above ground level outside. The floor was bare with plain wooden chairs, and as the sittings progressed, an open 3-sided cabinet standing near the east wall and bolted to the floor was added. Illumination was supplied by a ruby red ceiling light controlled by a dimmer switch. Sittings took place either in dim red light or, more frequently, in total darkness. The room was locked from the outside between the hour-long weekly sittings and was locked from within while a séance was in progress. The cabinet was a 3-sided box of 3/4-inch wood with an open top and front and fastened to the floor with metal straps. The medium would often sit in this cabinet, or the table might be placed in it behind a screen. A battery of cameras using very high-speed flash powder and equipped with a variety of lenses were beginning to record the telekinetic phenomena. Dr. Hamilton was an excellent amateur photographer, using the best quality of flash powder, bulbs, and paper. He did all his own developing, enlarging, and printing. There were several trays fixed near the center of the camera area. These trays held devices filled with magnesium powder, and a thin wire was embedded in the powder. When the switch was thrown, the electric current flowing through the wire ignited the magnesium powder, and a bright flash of light resulted from the ignition. Each tray was good for 1 flash before it had to be refilled with powder. There was also smoke and dust as a result of the explosion, and this made an exhaust fan a necessity. The sitters entered the séance room with only the red ceiling light on. Dr. Hamilton would load the cameras with film. The film being used in the cameras was orthochromatic film, fairly insensitive to red light, so that to the film the red-lit room appeared to be in darkness. Dr. Hamilton would open the shutters of selected cameras just before the sitting began. This was so that when the magnesium light flashed, the film could be exposed. After exposure, the camera shutters had to be closed, and a new set of camera shutters were opened for another exposure. This made a number of cameras a necessity, so that several exposures could be made during a given séance, but separated by a time interval. The magnesium flashlight was exploded by means of an electric switch held in Dr. Hamilton's hand at the exact moment that the table was seen or heard to move. As the flash went off in approximately a 30th of a second, fraudulent manipulation of the table by anyone present was impossible, for had such a thing been attempted, the trickster would have been caught in the act. Scores of times they photographed the rapidly moving table by this means, as it flung itself upward, as it inverted itself, as it moved within the curtained cabinet, completely cut off from all possibility of contact, and as it rushed out of the cabinet entirely on its own. The experimental group, consisting usually of 5 regular sitters in addition to the medium, sat in the usual chain formation. These were all well known to the Hamiltons, and they were persons whose integrity of character and standing in their several callings were of the highest. 1 or more visitors were often present as additional observers and verifiers. Records were kept of each sitting, the notes being made either during the time an experiment was in progress or shortly after its close. All the facts which will presently be laid before the viewers are drawn from these notes. The seance table, which weighed about 10 to 12.5 pounds, was made of walnut, unvarnished, measuring 16 by 16 by 32, and although old, was strongly built. To render the table visible in the dark seance room, it was fitted on the top with a 12 by 12 inch plywood square, painted with luminous paint. Around the outer edge of the table was tacked a strip of tape, also painted. On September 22, 1921, with Mrs. Poole and Lillian Hamilton sitting, and visitors Mrs. J.F. Campbell and Mrs. Legatt, the table, under contact, lifted 5 times off the floor, between about 2 to 6 inches. The 3rd time it was held for a second or 2. On October 16, the table was raised up almost beyond reach of the sitters. The number of liftings occurring at one sitting also showed a definite progression, 2, 3, 5, and then a repetition of the phenomenon up to 8 or 10 times. On November 14, 1921, the levitation of the table, about 20 minutes after the sitting commenced, was estimated by the sitters to be about 20 inches off the floor. Mr. H. Shand, an engineer, a visitor, was unable to depress the table to the floor. Heavy knocks were heard on the floor during the levitation. Often, when the experiment ceased, she showed marked reactions, frequently found to be in a more or less faint condition, her face pale, her hands cold, and she appeared more or less dazed. In other words, everything went to show that the medium's body energy was being drawn up on in a way which was supernormal. As already indicated, in the course of a few weeks the table began to show a tendency to raise itself off the floor entirely, and in the course of a few months we watched this upward movement grow steadily in magnitude until it progressed from a levitation of a few inches to that of 3 or 4 feet. These levitations were at first contact phenomena, but ended by being non-contact. That is, the medium placed her hands on the table, it became activated, her hands were withdrawn and controlled, and the table continued on its upward flight unaided by anything of a known physical nature. The Elizabeth trance automatism, like her other manifestations, progressed in time from the simple to the complex. The motor automatisms began with simple signaling movements of the right hand, and in a few months the more complicated movements of writing supervened, and finally progressed to the still more complex coordinations of speech. The sensory automatisms have been, and still are, the most outstanding features of this mediumship. These take the form of visions or hallucinations, clear and vivid as to details, and although received during the most profound part of the trance sleep, are nevertheless recalled by the medium on her return to consciousness. So, with Elizabeth Poole's developing trance receptivity, Stead was one of the communicators appearing at intervals to give directions, and making comments in regard to the progress of the Hamilton investigations. An especially interesting feature of the Elizabeth trance phenomena is the fact that the 2 types of automatisms, the mental and the motor, both appear in the same trance period. The motor always follows the sensory, and always the 2 are complementary to each other. Only rarely can the written message be fully understood without a study of the vision message. The two make the whole. Dr. Hamilton did not seek primarily for evidence of surviving personalities. He was simply willing to examine any psychical phenomena which could be verified by repeated observation and experiment. The Elizabeth mental manifestations met this demand as successfully as the physical. Further studies brought to light mental phenomena pointing to the survival of mind and memory of certain individuals, and materialization phenomena appeared, giving some ground for the belief that death was not the end of the human personality. There was, however, the other query: did someone else present, one of the experimenters for instance, unknowingly formulate the ideas conveyed by the raps? Such an explanation had to be considered, however far-fetched and complicated it might appear. Or had they unwittingly tapped some part of a cosmic mind force which sent out the strangely pertinent manifestations of intelligence? If it is established that mechanical vibrations can be produced in matter and without contact, and that these vibrations exhibit intelligence, we have the truly far-reaching fact that there are in the universe human or non-human intelligences that can act directly on matter. For in every case, the invisible signalers claimed to be not subconscious entities or cosmic intelligences, but human beings who had survived physical death, and who were now making efforts to prove this claim to be true. 40 experiments in all were conducted at this time, leading to two main conclusions. Psychic force was a scientific fact. This force was under the control of an unknown mind, which in each case appeared to be external to those present. How difficult this work was is shown when, in a rare moment, Dr. Hamilton shared some of his thoughts in a writing that was found among his papers after his death. Quote, "The scientific features make this class of work very tedious and often boring to the experimenters. Results have to be extremely slow and consequently repeated experiments tried, which fail. The fact of it being so uninteresting makes it practically impossible for some to endure with patience. Many who wish to be entertained give up in disgust." Following these initial experimental sessions, Dr. Hamilton shut the door on his inquiry, as he thought, for good, but events were to decree otherwise. 9 months after the last sitting had been held, in which telekinesis had been carefully observed and tested by Dr. Hamilton, they held an impromptu sitting with Mrs. Poole for a friend who was their guest, and to their surprise raps again appeared, and out in the shadows of their living room, letter by letter, gave this message: "Go on with your work. More ahead. W.T. Stead." Although they could not know it at the time, the real work of the Hamilton Circle had only begun. All that had gone before was preliminary, a preparation for a massive unfolding of evidence that mind, memory, imagination, will, choice, purpose, and all other facets of human personality survive the clutch of what we call death. It was January 1923. In the videos ahead, we shall examine an outline of the nature of the mental evidence which Stevenson and others gave to the Hamilton group along these profoundly important lines. Unfortunately, the abridged treatment of this part of the work, due to the immense amount of material put in evidence, is not truly indicative of the planned, unique, and complex evidence moving slowly from point to point, conclusively revealing cumulative growth from the simple to the more complex, with intelligence and literary acumen ruling over all. Stead was so very right. There was indeed much more ahead. At this point, however, concluding that Mrs. Poole had revealed all the phenomena of which her mediumship was capable, and his professional duty still very heavy, for some time no more researches were carried out by Dr. Hamilton and Mr. Reed, the work now subsiding for a while to impromptu sittings under Lillian Hamilton's guidance. But things were again changing and bringing Dr. Hamilton's interest into play once more. Mrs. Poole began showing signs of incipient trance, and out of this incipient trance state there appeared now and again visions and pictures which at first consisted of what she described as still life items. Some of these visions were of a most veridical character, veridical that is, in regard to the past of one of those present, and therefore open to be explained solely on the basis of telepathy between the mind of the sitter and the subject. Curiously enough, a progressive movement could be seen here, visions first of flowers, then of faces, then of wayside scenes, then of panoramic scenes, showing within them human action, some of these, as already stated, reminiscent of certain past events known to the sitters. There were visions of flowers, visions of stills, of scenes in which all objects were at rest. Then, in the next stage, visions in which some of the objects showed motion. Then visions in which human beings appeared, but it was clear that they were more like cutouts rather than flesh and blood. And finally, visions in which the human beings took on the appearance and characteristics of life. The transference of their main interest to the new phenomena seemed in no way to inhibit or prevent the appearances of their older friends from before, Stead, Stevenson, Myers, and others. Robert Louis and David Livingstone still wrote and gave visions through Elizabeth Poole as before, although they were now less brilliant and showed some falling away in design and importance. Spurgeon, who had also repeatedly manifested through the older mediumship, spoke and wrote to Elizabeth on occasion, and Myers, who now appeared for the first time since 1921, wrote in conjunction with Stead that on no account must they eliminate Mrs. Poole from their sittings. Her great powers were still needed. White light was excluded as effectively as possible from the seance room, as it was found by experiment in the case of the Poole mediumship that its presence hindered the collecting and amassing of the psychic energy necessary to produce results. Mrs. Poole, who was quite plump but short, around 4'8", was strapped to the chair and her legs tied to the two front legs, and she wore luminous arm and ankle bands and buttons on her sweater. At times they heard vigorous blows on the back of the seance room cabinet, blows which made an impression in soft plasticine hidden in place by Dr. Hamilton and unknown to anyone else, and which responded appropriately to requests. They imprisoned the table in the cabinet by means of a heavy mesh curtain, and they obtained photographs of it pushing forward of its own power against the mesh screen. In 1922, to add to his workload, Dr. Hamilton became president of the Canadian Medical Association. In one conversation between sitters, Dr. Hamilton wondered whether or not more than one psychic in the room might cause confusion. He was of the opinion that they, the communicators, probably used one medium for one class of work and another for other work. The operators of the table responded with yes. 3 raps. Mr. Leslie, one of the sitters, voiced the opinion that the raps came through the subconscious mind of the medium. The operators responded with no. 1 rap. Lillian asked, "Are the raps produced, as in the Gallagher circle, by means of a rod formation?" "Yes," said the operators from the other side. In an April 1922 message by non-contact raps came the message, "Helping in amity, prepare, Myers and Stead." In April 1923, new work was started when through Elizabeth, the R.L. Stevenson trance personality suddenly began communicating by means of deep transcripts and simultaneous illustrative visions. As Lillian recorded, "Never had I seen T.G.H. so impressed as he was by this seemingly simple yet highly mysterious phenomenon. I remember he said to me with an almost boy-like grin, 'Well, Lillian, I guess there is more to this than I have been willing to admit. Get me a small group and we shall see what we can do with following these instructions.'" And with that, Dr. Hamilton embarked upon the most important work of his life. On March 29, 1923, by table tilts came some R.L. Stevenson children's poems. Dr. Hamilton recorded that on April 8, 1923, Elizabeth suddenly and spontaneously passed into the deep sleep of genuine trance for the first time. Her body became fully relaxed, her head fell on my shoulder, and she slept for about 10 minutes. Then she roused partially, and to our surprise, while she was in this state, her right hand began, with noticeable precision and vigor, to slap a small table which happened to be standing in front of her, as if some unseen intelligence were taking this method of signaling to us. Dr. Hamilton recorded that he called over the alphabet, and her hand slaps indicated the letters stick together, Spurgeon. On regaining full consciousness, Elizabeth said that she had had a vision of a stout, florid-faced man preaching to a crowd of people in a large auditorium of some kind. It was not a Presbyterian church, she said. They were singing Moody and Sankey hymns, not psalms or paraphrases. This presented the perfect opportunity for first-hand observation of trance in the seance room. The personnel of the group remained fairly constant for some time, thus ensuring stability and harmony of emotional atmosphere. Dr. Hamilton found that the proper study of the trance must have a standardized set of constant conditions, which are important factors in its production and maintenance. Changes in the standard conditions might cause the mediums to become emotionally upset or mentally worried, and this had a detrimental effect on the trance products. The personality qualities of the sitters was also of great importance, and those to the right and left of the medium needed to keep to a constant seating arrangement. The state of the medium's health, physical and emotional, had a bearing on the trance depth and the quality of the trance products. The deep trance was found to be an attunement process. It was noted that too much expectancy created a block. However, pleasant music provided a diversion. Mental quietude on the part of all the sitters was important. During the time that the deep trance phenomena were beginning, the telekinetic phenomena were also becoming more powerful. On April 8, with no hands touching it, the table moved jerkily out of the cabinet. On April 15, 1923, during the second trance of the seance, Elizabeth's hand slap spelled R.L. Stevenson, Margaret. Elizabeth awakened from trance and said she had seen a lighthouse while in trance. A new phenomenon of importance had made its entry into the experiments. Mrs. Poole now for the first time pounded her hand on the table in place of communicating by the tilting table, and in response to the alphabet spelled out the words which later were found to make still further reference to the life of Stevenson. The date of his birth, the date of his death, the names of his father and mother, and along with this the name Skerryvore. The latter they were to find later the name of the famous Stevenson Lighthouse, built off the coast of Argyllshire by Stevenson's father and uncles, and of which, as his writings show, he had very fond memories. Nor was this all. A deep trance vision accompanied this pounded out message, and fittingly it was a vision mainly representing this lighthouse. The two phenomena were in reality one, evidential reference and illustration. The reference was old, it could be found in books, but the vision was new, a planned picture, they saw, made up at the time, and thus bespeaking a communicator not only familiar with Stevenson's past, but able now to imagine representative imagery, and thus show that the mind of this communicator was like our own, that it possessed all of the facets of a full mental personality. On this day thus began and continued, side by side with powerful movements of material object by psychic force, the so-called Stevenson communications. These communications were to go on for some 6 years, and always to conform to this one pattern: manually delivered message, by slaps, or later on by writing, and the companion vision. On April 19, 1923, while at her home, Elizabeth had a vision of a mountain and saw the letters APIA. Apia is the name of the main town in Samoa near where Stevenson had lived. On April 20, 1923, again at home, she had a vision of a dark-haired man wearing a velvet coat. Stevenson was fond of velvet coats in life. On April 21, 1923, another trans personality made himself known. A personality differing from all other trans personalities and differing wholly from that of the medium. This control first appeared in the first Elizabeth Deep Trance in April 1923, preceding the Stevenson control in one experiment. After these two appearances, and for nearly 5 years after this, the Spurgeon communicator disappeared entirely from view. So on April 22, 1923, the main work began. By Elizabeth's hand slaps came Thomas Stevenson, Margaret Isabel Balfour. The trance was the deepest yet observed. Later, partly out of trance, Elizabeth said, "I get a date, 1894. Somebody died in 1894. Then she exclaimed, "Let me out of these rocks." Then, more fully normal, she continued, "I was among hills, Highland, I think, and then I was taken away in a boat and I came to a lighthouse. I saw a lot of machinery and lanterns. I saw a name painted on a signboard near the lighthouse. It was Skerryvore. I saw 2 dates, 1850, 1894. What does that mean?" Upon consulting some books, the Hamiltons discovered these verifications. Thomas Stevenson, that was the name of R.L. Stevenson's father. Margaret Isabella Balfour was the name of Stevenson's mother. 1850, Stevenson's birth. 1894, Stevenson's death. Skerryvore was the name of the most famous of the Stevenson lighthouses, built on a reef 15 miles off the coast of Argyllshire, Scotland. At this time, Stevenson was a name only to those present at the sitting, and no one was aware of any of the facts. The verification was obtained by Lillian, consulting the Encyclopedia Britannica and Stevenson biographies in the Winnipeg Public Library. On the afternoon of April 30, 1923, Elizabeth phoned Lillian to tell her that while she was resting, she saw that man, and she asked, "Who is Cummy? Cummy? What a funny name. Well, anyway, he says he is going to give me something. I don't know what it is." Early in May of 1923, Elizabeth saw, sometime during the night in her home, a forest fire burning fiercely. Of 2 things she was certain. The burning trees were spruce trees, and the fire would be reported in the Winnipeg papers. As verification, 3 days later, both the evening papers reported that a large fire had taken place in the spruce reserves in the southwest section of the province, these lying roughly 300 miles distant from Winnipeg. During the May 3, 1923 sitting, Elizabeth slept quietly for some 10 minutes, then her hand slap spelled, "My first wife, take the little book." Elizabeth, coming awake, said, "Who is that old woman there?" When completely out of trance, she described this vision. "I saw an old lady, old-fashioned, who was 44 or 5. She had on a little shawl, 3-cornered, thrown over her shoulders, and a plain tight bodice, and a cap on. She was talking to a young man. He gave her something. He was pretty frail looking, long face, dark hair, whitely looking, sickly." Later she expanded on her own thoughts. "That old lady was old enough to be his mother, but I did not hear the word mother. After he gave her the parcel, she patted him." Verification. For several days this whole layout was not understood. Happening to glance at the Child's Garden of Verse, Lillian stumbled onto the lines, "My second mother, my first wife, the angel of my infant life. From the sick child, now well and old, take, nurse, the book you hold." This was from the dedicatory poem to Alison Cunningham, Child's Garden of Verse. The imagery and the message now fell into place. The hand message had been made up from "My first wife," line 1, "take the book" from line 4, with one new word added, "little," This was obviously planned imagery. On May 31st, 1923, after return to normal consciousness, Elizabeth reported this vision. I was at a funeral. There was lots of flowers everywhere on the casket and outside. I saw two ministers. One had on something white like a coat, the other was in dark clothes. I followed the casket to the foot of the hill, and then I lost it. One of the ministers led in prayer. Oh, I could see it all so plain. I could see the sun shining so bright. Such a cluster of people about it. I bowed my head in prayer. Verification. All details of this imagery are correct. The day of Stevenson's funeral was exceedingly bright, flowers in bloom everywhere, flowers in the great hall brought by Samoan friends, two ministers present, one an Anglican, the other Presbyterian, the hill vale on which Stevenson was buried. The hand text does not deal with Stevenson's death directly. It places emphasis on the relationship between prayer and goodness of the human personality, and it does this by quoting something Stevenson said as a child. You cannot be good unless you pray. In the vision, prayer is twice enacted, first by the minister and then by the medium. In the text, prayer and goodness and death are interwoven. Many more examples of verifiable facts from Stevenson's life were passed by him through a medium who had never read any of his books, with the possible exception of Treasure Island. On June 4, 1923, Elizabeth, in a vision, visits Stevenson's grave on Mount Vea. The inevitability of death was recalled by a sentence written in a letter to Stevenson's mother in 1868. The communication in mind occurred very early in the work. In fact, at this sitting of June 4, 1923, at the time when the medium's faculties for trance-writing had not been developed, the message, as delivered by the slaps struck on the table, read, "That will come like gray hair or coffin nail." When the medium awoke from her trance sleep, she related her experiences in these words. "Okay, I've been among rocks. I saw a woman at the rock. But mind you, I went one way, but I did not come back that way. I came back by a narrow footpath between rocks. I went along a road that wound around the hill, in and out. It seemed to be an island. Then I came to this lady beside the big stone. It came up past her waist. It was kind of bluish-gray. It seems to be peaked at the top and long. I leaned over this rock with this lady. It might have been split rock. Then she came to me and talked to me, but I could not tell what she said. But after we left the stone, the lady went ahead and went down a footpath. I did not want to go at first, for I couldn't see any path at all, just rocks everywhere. It was dreadfully difficult. If you could have seen those rocks, you would have thought so. If you were going up, you certainly would need chains to hang on to. The path had to go around big rocks. After a while I came to a little stream. I seemed to lose the lady. Then I could see a house. My, I like my pictures. I don't know whether they are correct or not, but I see them so clear. The sun was so bright." The vision setting was a fairly simple matter. It was a recognizable representation of the top of Mount Vea in Samoa, where Stevenson and his wife are buried. That he, the alleged Stevenson, believed himself to be the deceased Robert Louis Stevenson is clear. Some of the communications, which were more factual and that they were less marked by the play acting, which we have seen, reminded the observers that he was marred by sickness in his youth, that he seemed to have gaiety, and because of this his ailing body was praised. That, in his literary aspirations, he had had 1,000 projects. Was this from Stevenson? The Hamiltons did not know. But 2 years later, Lillian accidentally found the answer. The phrase had been taken from a letter written by Stevenson to his mother in his 18th year from Wick, Scotland, where he was studying harbour engineering with his father. There had been a great storm, and the high waves had damaged the new construction. The young Stevenson did not see the storm as an engineer, but as an artist. He is aware of his failure in this way and speaks of it. How could father appreciate a storm at Wick? It requires a little of the artistic temperament of which Mr. Thomas Stevenson possesses some, whatever he may say. I can't look at it practically, however. That will come, I suppose, like gray hair or coffin nails. Your affectionate son, R.L.S. The interpretation of the quotation is of course obvious. Its theme is the inevitability of death. Stevenson's burial place seen by the medium in hallucinatory form serving as the fitting illustration of this idea. Well, death had come, and now looking back, Stevenson the communicator recalls this youthful flippancy and logically associates it with a picture of his own resting place on a mountaintop in Samoa. Lillian makes the comment, "We had no doubts whatever that through Elizabeth's trance the mind of the living Stevenson had somehow contacted us. Everywhere the case pointed to the impact of a supernormal mind on the mind of the simple, motherly, unlearned little woman." The nature of her trance appeared to be related to the trance of deep hypnosis. The flow of literary and biographical data were totally unknown to her. The constant planned output showed matching ideas in vision and message. In short, almost from the first, Dr. Hamilton and Lillian saw that what came was a type of cross-correspondence between two brain or mind centers. The sensory center and the motor center in each case were made to show some form of correspondence. To account for this, there had to be postulated the existence of an independent mind, widely and deeply acquainted with all of the multiplicity of details of Stevenson's life. The ultimate verification of the coffin nail phrase, as with many others, solidified further such an hypothesis. On June 10, 1923, Stevenson referred to his method of learning to write. Elizabeth had a vision of an old church. She entered the church and heard the minister preach on the text, "For God so loved the world." By hand slaps came the message, "I, always 2 books with me, want to read and write." Verification. Here the imagery is relatively unimportant. It only serves to remind the communicator of Scotland. The hand text was soon placed. "I always was busy on my own private ends, which were to learn to write. I kept 2 books with me in my pocket, one to read, one to write in." This was found in a college magazine, page 55, in Memories and Portraits. On July 1st, 1923, the script was a tribute to Stevenson's wife in reference to the success of marriage. The velvet coat appeared in the vision, and Stevenson was wearing this coat. With Stevenson was a lady, presumably his wife. The hand text came. "It was best work I did, was married." The verification. In life, Stevenson wrote, "As I look back, I think my marriage was the best move I ever made in my life."